That's right, kids. Do you enjoy listening to Primus and want to see Hannibal Lecter make potato chips out of each one of your eyelids? Once upon a time, horror put on its best face, literally, and was the belle of the fanciest ball of them all.
Every pretty girl deserves to go to a ball.
Just how did our beloved little genre shed the judgment of the people to reach the tippity top of the mountain? Let's find out together just WTF happened to 1991's The Silence of the Lambs. In 1981, Thomas Harris published a novel titled Red Dragon, which featured an FBI profiler who must turn to an imprisoned serial killer and cannibal to capture another killer dubbed the Tooth Fairy. Though, I must admit, I feel weird reducing the nuanced man known as Hannibal Lecter to the term cannibal. I feel like we should call him a fancy cannibal or something.
I ate his liver with some fava beans and a nice Chianti.
The book was so successful, it would be adapted into a film in 1986, starring Brian Cox as the titular character, titled Manhunter. The film was met, at the time, with minimal success, but that didn't stop Thomas Harris from penning his sequel novel. You guessed it, Electric Boogaloo 2, Secret of the Ooze. Okay, you got me. The Silence of the Lambs. Originally, The Silence of the Lambs was to be produced in part by filmmaker-friendly Orion Films, and partly financed as well by the great Gene Hackman, who was set to direct and possibly star in the film as agent in charge of the behavioral science unit of the FBI, Jack Crawford. Hackman was excited enough to put up $250,000 of his own money to help finance the film, and writer Ted Talley was chosen to adapt the screenplay from the novel. Oddly enough, while the script was still being written, Hackman decided that the film was just too violent and that there was no way he could do it. Orion was cool with it and refunded his money. Executive VP of Orion at the time, Mike Medavoy, told screenwriter Ted Talley, "Keep writing, don't give up, and when you finish the script, we will find another director." Medavoy reached out to his frequent collaborator and director of Married to the Mob, Jonathan Demme. It seemed like a strange match at the time, with even Medavoy stating, "Most people thought I was really being foolish to go with Jonathan on a picture like this, but I knew his work and I felt like he could do a really good type of thriller." Demme originally declined the offer, taking a quick look at it and deciding it was just another run-of-the-mill slasher, but when encouraged to look deeper, he realized the project had potential. With a director and a script in place, it was time to cast the role of Hannibal Lecter, a role so pivotal that it would have to be a performance that would eat people's faces off. Literally. The legendary Sean Connery was reached out to, but declined due to the character's chest hair not being shown enough. Unfortunately, that's a lie, I think. Like Hackman, the film proved to be too violent for Connery. Little did they know this picture would be the one to break that stigma, possibly more than any other before it or since. That is, until the Winnie the Pooh slasher sequel releases. Then they'll have no choice but to respect us. Moving on, the list of actors once considered for the role of Lecter would become more intimidating than Donnie Darko's Iowa test scores. It was a list that would feature Al Pacino, Robert De Niro, Forrest Whitaker, and Daniel Day-Lewis. But the movie gods knew only one man was meant to play the role, and finally, Anthony Hopkins came into the fold. Hopkins said of receiving the script for the first time, "I thought it was a children's story, a bedtime story, and I knew when I read the script it was probably going to change a lot of things in my life. This is that sort of once-in-a-lifetime script that comes along." Well said, Anthony. Now, do the mouth noise. Do the mouth noise. With Hopkins in the fold and working on creating what would be one of the scariest human beings ever to grace a screen, the hunt for our heroine, FBI agent Clarice Starling, was also taking place. Demme had suggested Michelle Pfeiffer after working with her before, but she turned down the project due to it not having enough violence in it for her personal tastes. Just kidding. She said it was too violent as well. There was indeed an actress not only willing to accept the role, but actively pursuing and campaigning for it. Her name was Jodie Foster. The perfect casting wouldn't stop there, however. as the thankless role of serial killer Buffalo Bill was thankfully taken on by the great Ted Levine. Now, don't get me wrong, we'd all have a total blast blaring some Goodbye Horses, dancing around and trying on some sweet new threads. But this role came with its own dark baggage for Levine, who would end up being typecast not only career-wise, but sometimes in his personal life. He was so haunting and believable in the role that he once said he really had to sort of fight to be seen as husband, father, good person kind of thing. But still, people respect me for it. A respect that's well deserved. That role and the infamous lines like,
It rubs the lotion on its skin or else it gets the hose again.
Just wouldn't have been the same without his dedicated performance to the role. Furthermore, the character itself was the source of what may be the Silence of the Lambs' biggest controversy of all, when activist groups found themselves upset at their opinion of the film's portrayal of the LGBT community, which led to controversy in that community and many protests of the film. Despite both Demme and Levine being on the record stating they never saw the character as LGBT. Part of the argument was that the character simply hated himself so much he wanted to get as far away from himself as possible, which for him was in the literal skin of a woman.
Billy is not a real transsexual, but he thinks he is. He tries to be. He's tried to be a lot of things, I expect.
The Silence of the Lambs would go on to round out an absolutely astounding supporting cast that included Scott Glenn as Clarice's boss, Jack Crawford, in a role based on the real-life FBI agent John E. Douglas, who actually helped prep Jack Crawford for the role. In fact, the FBI were more than accommodating to the production of Silence of the Lambs, even letting them film their FBI training sequences on location in Quantico, Virginia. The FBI saw the character of Agent Starling and her portrayal by Jodie Foster as so impressive, they considered it a recruiting tool for future female agents and offered to help any way they could. This aspect of The Silence of the Lambs was a backbone for the film from the very beginning. Throughout the film's entirety, we are placed in the point of view of Starling. If you notice throughout, the extreme close-ups of characters while speaking to Starling are looking directly at the audience. However, during Starling's close-ups, she's looking slightly away to specifically put us in her point of view. Another theme of the film is just how difficult it was for her to navigate this world of the FBI as a female amongst mostly dismissive males, including Anthony Heald as Dr. Frederick Chilton, who was amazing in playing the epitome of a complete and total douche nozzle.
You know, we get a lot of detectives here, but I must say I can't ever remember what's attractive.
In fact, it is suspected that the character of Starling was the main draw of the initial creation of the novel to begin with. Screenwriter Ted Talley stated, "I think what especially interested Tom when writing Silence of the Lambs was to try to live inside the mind of a female character, to put a woman at the center of a book, and I think that was the challenge he set himself, which pays off in a major way as we learn not only about Starling's past, but watch her literally earn her skills and toughness as the movie unfolds. This makes the audience feel oh so vulnerable when she's locked in the dark basement of this absolute super shredder level psycho wearing night vision goggles and reaching for her hair like fake Michael Myers reaching for Laurie before getting his head chopped off." Anthony Hopkins embodied Hannibal Lecter with his looks, voice, and movements in a way that burns itself into your brain and leaves you in fear, but absolutely captivated with his every movement. Hopkins absolutely transcends into an utter madman while simultaneously being the calmest man in the room. Of his portrayal, Hopkins said, "They talk about him for 10 minutes before he's seen as if he's some babbling psychopath, and I wanted to play him the opposite. You always play the opposite of what the audience expects." Hopkins maintained eye contact with whomever he was speaking with, while moving his head as little as possible and not blinking. The result is absolutely terrifying. I would argue that it has to be in any conversation for the single greatest horror performance of all time. As far as his look and presence, a lot of work and brilliant decision making went into that as well. Painstaking efforts were made to decide on his overalls and overall look, which went from orange and yellow jumpsuits, ultimately deciding on the dark blue before Hopkins recommended he wear all white during the escape scene because it reminded him of his fear of dentists. The infamous half mask we see during his transport to keep him from getting bitey was created by a man named Ed Cubberley, who created masks for NHL goalkeepers. The FX crew ordered the mask with the intention of painting it to their liking once it had arrived, but the paint job worked so well for that whole I eat people aesthetic that they decided to leave it just as it came, and history was made. The classic scenes of Starling and Lecter going back and forth were set up using plexiglass rather than your typical prison bars to make the close-ups of Lecter far more intimate than they would have been with bars between the camera lens and the audience. This also afforded a chance for Hopkins to ad-lib smelling Clarice through the holes. When I think of The Silence of the Lambs, I think of it as the horror genre's version of Morgan Freeman walking through the library in Seven, while Johann Sebastian Bach's Suite No. 3 in D major played over the speakers. It's a film that just feels so refined and prestigious, despite having just as much depraved and sadistic content as any other horror film. This is part due to the people involved from the top to the bottom. Nearly every account of working on the set created by Jonathan Demme and company was a complimentary one. This culture created the environment for everyone to do their best work, including the FX team, which thought it would be disrespectful to use true crime photos as the movie told of Buffalo Bill's previous crimes. They instead went through painstaking details of bringing in actors and recreating the corpses of the victims before photographing them. The moths found in the victims' throats were even made of Tootsie Rolls and gummies, so that if an accident occurred and they were swallowed, the actor would be safe. All of these folks' best efforts would pay off in the end, with The Silence of the Lambs being released onto the masses on Valentine's Day weekend of 1991, and raking in $17 million of its $20 million budget back on the opening weekend alone. Then, due to word of mouth and excellent critics' reviews, the film would stay at number 1 in the box office for a whopping 5 weeks. The Silence of the Lambs would end up making $273 million worldwide. It became an international sensation. On the initial $20 million budget, producer Ron Bozeman said, "It was a pretty modest production. It wasn't an attempt to go make it an Academy Award-winning film."
And the Oscar goes to The Silence of the Lambs.
The Silence of the Lambs arrived on Oscar night and took home awards for Best Director, Best Actor, Best Actress, Best Adapted Screenplay, and Best Picture. Anthony Hopkins won the award for Best Actor despite having the lowest on-screen time percentage than any other before him, having been on screen for only 21% of the film. The Silence of the Lambs is now widely considered one of the greatest films of all time and produced multiple sequels.
Because let's face it, baby, these days, you gotta have a sequel.
And a beloved yet canceled far too early TV show in Hannibal. Anthony Hopkins went from almost giving up on a Hollywood career to being knighted by Queen Elizabeth II for services to the arts, and is now known as Sir Anthony Hopkins if you're nasty. That's what I call putting the lotion in the basket. And that is WTF happened to The Silence of the Lambs.
I do wish we could chat longer, but I'm having an old friend for dinner.
When The Silence of the Lambs was released upon the world in 1991, it not only became a financial and critical success, but also the third film in history to win all 5 of the big awards at the Oscars, you knew it meant one thing: Tostitos Pizza Rolls. Because that's the best way to celebrate any achievement. No, it meant a sequel.
Everyone's gonna be happy.
Thank God it released in the 90s and not today. Forget a sequel, Disney would have purchased the rights and farmed out an entire cinematic universe. I can see it now. You've seen Hannibal Lecter behind bars, but have you ever seen him in the classroom? This summer on Disney Plus, it's Hannibal High. Why does it feel like that's a thing that would actually happen, and why is it so frightening? Anyways, A Silence of the Lambs sequel was destined to produce itself, but this was no ordinary follow-up. The Silence of the Lambs was based off an uber-popular novel by Thomas Harris, so any respectable sequel would need to follow the same path. The follow-up novel, however, would take 7 years to make its appearance in 1998, which, again, would be unheard of by today's sequel standards. The film would release only 2 years after that in 2001. Sounds like an easy production, which easily brought back the trio of Anthony Hopkins, Jodie Foster, and director Jonathan Demme to create a sequel that naturally feels like a successor to the original award-winning film, right?
Wrong.
Nothing would be the same. So, sit back, pop some pizza rolls in the microwave or oven if you're fancy. Personally, I think Lecter would be an oven guy. Pour yourself some Chianti and let's get into just WTF happened to Hannibal.
This is really gonna hurt.
Originally, everything was in place just as you would imagine. It was expected that Jodie Foster would return to the character she cared so much about, and that Jonathan Demme would direct. The table was set. A bad choice of words. As I learned from the same place I get all my life lessons from, a Steven Seagal movie, assumption is the mother of all fuck-ups. The book was a bestseller with wild financial success that was met with middling reviews. Stephen King loved it, however, ranking it alongside The Exorcist as one of the scariest novels of all time. All this was good enough to convince producers Martha and Dino De Laurentiis to pay a whopping $10 million for the rights to adapt Hannibal into a film. That number may seem absolutely nuts, but the De Laurentiises had more skin in the game than a room full of Buffalo Bill dresses. You see, they produced the first ever Lambs franchise film in 1986 with Manhunter, an adaptation of Harris's first Lecter novel, Red Dragon, that he wasn't all that impressed with. So much so that he lent the rights to Orion to make The Silence of the Lambs for free, which also seems utterly insane until you hear Martha describe the choice, saying, quote, "We were afraid to make the movie. You could be terrible and say no, or you could demand money, which was kind of, why be greedy? Or you let them use it, and if it's successful, your asset has value," unquote. And it had value by the buttload. All this, and we haven't even mentioned a settled $25 million lawsuit they got into with Universal over the production of the sequel. The De Laurentiises were knee-deep and involved with this franchise since the beginning. They weren't about to walk away now. There was just one problem. The book they just purchased the rights to, while financially successful and Stephen King approved, was absolutely nuts.
You're crazy. I like you. But you're crazy.
The end of Thomas Harris's novel would take the beloved character of Clarice Starling, which Foster and Demme were understandably precious about, on a Rob Zombie's Halloween 2 level departure off the deep end. The book would ultimately end with Starling and Lecter as not only teammates, but lovers. That's right, lovers. In the book, they dined on Ray Liotta's prefrontal cortex together before Clarice revealed one of her breasts to Lecter, who, by the way, had spent a considerable amount of time using multiple versions of therapy to turn her into, wait for it, his long-lost sister, before the two ran off together and lived happily ever after, where they spent their days having sex, dancing, and learning new languages. That actually happened.
I'm not sure what to do with my hands.
Determined and $10 million lighter, the production pushed on and De Laurentiis was able to acquire Alien director Sir Ridley Scott himself to helm the project. In a hilarious exchange, Dino handed Scott the script for Hannibal while Scott was making Gladiator, which he immediately rejected, thinking it was about the historical figure and Carthaginian general, saying, quote, "Dino, I don't want to do elephants coming over the Alps. I'm doing a Roman movie now," end quote. To sort out the confusion, and the rest is history. Really weird history. Scott also thought that Harris's original ending was as baffling as the rest of us, saying, quote, "I couldn't take that quantum leap emotionally on behalf of Starling. Certainly on behalf of Hannibal. I'm sure that's been in the back of his mind for a number of years. But for Starling, no. I think one of the attractions about Starling to Hannibal is what a straight arrow she is," unquote. Harris was slightly open to the changing of his ending, but wanted to know what it would be. Though he was famously reclusive, they somehow got the writer to sit in a hotel room for 4 days with new screenplay writers David Mamet, who wrote Glengarry Glen Ross, and Steve Zalian, who would later write The Irishman, and hash everything out. And so, the film had gone out and got itself a new writer and director. At least they'd have the cast back, right? Right? Because you have to put the lotion in the basket, or you get the hose again. We were all about to get the hose again, and in a big way. That sounded weird. Jodie Foster, much like Demi before her, remained unpleased with the drastic changes to her character. She would ultimately walk away from the project, later saying, quote, "The official reason I didn't do Hannibal is I was doing another movie, Floor Plum. So I get to say, in a nice, dignified way, that I wasn't available when that movie was being shot," unquote. Ouch. She would also say, quote, "Clarice meant so much to Jonathan and I know it sounds kind of strange to say, but there was no way that either of us could really trample on her," unquote.
Go on now.
Foster would say after watching the final product of the film she wasn't in, quote, "I saw Hannibal. I won't comment," end quote. Probably means she loved it so much she couldn't find the words, right?
So you're telling me there's a chance?
Then there's the other side of the story, which Dino De Laurentiis says is drastically different in a 2001 interview with The Guardian, saying that her agent said she wouldn't even read the script without an offer of $20 million. His alleged response, quote, "Give my love to Judy Foster. Goodbye," end quote. And was happy about it, saying he, quote, "Didn't believe she was right from day one when I read the book," unquote. Regardless of the truth of the matter, the search for a new actress was on. After considering multiple actresses from Cate Blanchett to Angelina Jolie, landed on Assassins actress Julianne Moore. Moore was widely respected, and honestly a great choice to replace Jodie Foster. Unfortunately, it just wouldn't have felt right for the audience no matter who replaced Foster. Nevertheless, it's commendable that Moore had the guts to go in and give it her all. Anthony Hopkins, though said to be both hesitant and heartbroken when Foster wouldn't return, would be the polar opposite of difficult, and really, the actor equivalent of that friend who's always down to go out for a pint when you need a buddy. Hopkins hilariously said of his return, quote, "I thought, okay, fine. Let's see what it's like. I tend to be low-key about things like that," end quote. Later, they would ask him for his approval on Moore's casting, to which he replied, quote, "Oh yes, jolly good," end quote. "I just want to hug him. Is that weird?" He did later say about the project, however, quote, "I think it's a good film. The reservation I have about that idea, though, is that when Lecter is let out of his cell, he has no power. Because when he's confined in that cell, he's like a tarantula in a bottle. Once you let him out of that cell, there's nothing frightening about him," unquote. In the end, Lecter would feel quite less intense than he did in Lambs. Hopkins said he considered the character more mellow 10 years later, and, quote, "probably a much richer character," unquote. The character definitely felt a lot more refined with Scott and Hopkins diving headfirst into the cultured side of Lecter, all as he disemboweled detectives from rooftops and made chicken nuggies out of Ray Liotta's brain.
That smells great.
Speaking of Ray Liotta, the cast was rounded out most excellently with his hire as the resident FBI asshole who coined the term country pone in regard to female genitalia, whatever that means. Liotta was great in the film, as he was anything with his name attached to it, and allegedly got the part because he kept running into Ridley Scott at the gym and one day asked if he had any parts for him. Hollywood is so weird. The title of biggest creep in the film didn't belong to Liotta's character or even Lecter himself. No, That title belonged to the character of Mason Verger, a rich pedophile who looks like Mitch McConnell went 10 rounds with prime Mike Tyson, was eaten by a T-Rex, and shat into a volcano. Underneath all those lovely layers of absolutely haunting makeup, which took 5 to 6 hours a day to apply, was Gary Oldman, though you might not have known it since he wasn't mentioned in any of the opening credits. To hear Martha De Laurentiis tell it, Oldman wanted top billing alongside Hopkins and Moore, but for a while left the project when he couldn't get it. He then returned and asked not to be credited at all for the project, likely realizing that it would create the sort of legend and mystique that actors dream of and Jonah Hill still can't attain no matter who he sells his soul to. Just kidding, Jonah. You know I love you. Interestingly enough, the part was originally offered to the great Christopher Reeve, who thought that maybe playing a disgusting and disfigured pedophile wouldn't be all that great for his image. Copy that, Superman. In one of the wildest and coolest stories of the film, Verger wants revenge on Hopkins for, making him look like a bag of milk had a threesome with a Five Nights at Freddy's animatronic and an old catcher's mitt. This after Lecter had come over and seduced him, gave him a few poppers, and then told him to literally cut off his own face. And he did it.
Peer pressure. I'm far too sensitive.
This leads Mason to concoct a wild plot to put Starling in danger so that Lecter will come for her, and then he can catch Lecter and feed him to a pack of wild boar that he keeps hanging around the farm like
sharks with frickin' laser beams attached to their heads.
But the boars definitely made for some of the coolest horror effects in the film, with the crew buying a Russian boar head off of eBay and then using it for the close-ups or creating full-size human bodies made up of gelatin and stuffed with chicken and other assortments so that we, the audience, had the pleasure of seeing them believably and horrifyingly eat human beings. The crew outdid themselves, however, with the one scene you think about every time you think about Hannibal. It was a scene in which Lecter cuts chunks of Ray Liotta's brain out of his head as he's still lucid and cooks them on a skillet. For this scene, the crew had to create a full-scale model of Liotta to painstaking detail, and simultaneously shoot a version where Liotta himself sat in a chair with makeup. The result is unforgettable, and one of the most iconic horror scenes of all time, despite the overall reception to the film being quite murky. Hannibal debuted to the highest box office gross for a movie with an R rating on opening weekend, raking in $58 million. It went on to a worldwide total of $351 million overall. The film boasts a positive audience score on review aggregator Rotten Tomatoes, but 39% Rotten Critics score, with one critic saying it has, quote, no tension, no rhythm, and no sense of purpose unless you count Helping Faces of Death fans feel more evolved, end quote. One must admit, the process of watching Hannibal is a strange one.
I think so.
The film in itself is a well-made Ridley Scott film with an interesting story and some great horror moments peppered throughout. It suffers from a bit of Halloween Ends-itis, however, as while one could argue it to be a good standalone movie, it is in many ways a poor follow-up to its predecessor. The tones of the two films just don't sync up well at all, especially when you add in the fact that despite her best efforts, it's just weird to have a different human being in the role of Clarice when Hannibal is still the same Hannibal. It's also a little hard to suspend belief that someone on the FBI's most wanted list and famed serial killer with such distinct physical traits is just walking around in the open, giving lectures on art and sipping wine on restaurant patios. Even in the book, Lecter had undergone plastic surgery to make this all more believable. In the end, Hannibal crossed the finish line, made a whole bunch of money, and is quite an interesting watch, despite never truly feeling like the follow-up to The Silence of the Lambs. And that, my friends, is WTF happened to Hannibal.
A young woman says she's from the FBI, though she's far too pretty, if you ask me.
What is her name?
Hannibal Lecter, a name that has been cemented forever in the hearts of horror fans alike. We've seen him in some truly gruesome, yet unforgettable films, The most well-known is The Silence of the Lambs,
Lactated ringers running, and the patient is on 10 liters of oxygen.
which was followed up in 2001 with the mostly disliked self-titled Hannibal. But the very next year, in 2002, we were treated to somewhat of a redemption story of Hannibal Lecter in the form of Red Dragon. Did you know, though, that this wasn't the first time Red Dragon was made? Did you also know that none other than Brett Ratner, of then Rush Hour fame, directed this psychological thriller? Let's look back, sip some Chianti, and find out what the f*** happened to this horror movie. Let's get this settled right off the bat. Red Dragon is based on the novel of the same name written by Thomas Harris. But this is the second time it's been adapted for theatres. The first was back in 1986, titled Manhunter. It was directed by Michael Mann, who went on to direct such classics as Heat and Collateral. The film follows William Graham, who's a former FBI criminal profiler who's gone into retirement after being attacked by a cannibalistic serial killer known as Dr. Hannibal Lecter. William goes to Lecter for help to catch a serial killer known as the Tooth Fairy, aka Francis Dolarhyde. For those of you who haven't seen the film, you'd be surprised to know that Hannibal wasn't portrayed by Anthony Hopkins here. Instead, he was played by Brian Cox. You know, Logan Roy from Succession?
Did you get my card?
I got it, thank you.
And how is Officer Stewart? Oh no, I was first to see my basement.
The film was well received but performed poorly at the box office. It later received a cult following and was rediscovered on home video. Brian Cox basically walked so Anthony Hopkins could run, and it shows. During production, it held the title of Red Dragon to match its source material. However, during its release, the title was changed to Manhunter to avoid confusion with another film that was in production at the time, titled, you guessed it, Red Dragon. In 2001, Anthony Hopkins returned to star in Hannibal, a fun, gorier and more outrageous sequel to Silence of the Lambs. It was even directed by Ridley Scott, and Julianne Moore took the role of Clara Stalin this time. Critics weren't too kind, but audiences ran for a second helping of Hannibal Lecter. Husband and wife producers, Dino and Martha De Laurentiis, decided they wanted to produce a film based on the novel Red Dragon. People thought Dino was crazy for wanting to adapt a book that had previously been adapted. Anthony Hopkins was hesitant to sign on because he believed 3 Hannibal films might be too much for audiences. Screenwriter Ted Talley, who wrote The Silence of the Lambs, came back to write the script for Red Dragon. He liked the idea of Hopkins' Lecter films becoming a trilogy. Talley would go on and add scenes with Lecter that weren't even in the novel, calling it a commercial reality. Thomas Harris even gave Talley his support for the script. There were many changes made which caused concerns among fans of the book, who preferred a more faithful adaptation. The cast only signed on after hearing that Talley was writing the screenplay. Brett Ratner was hired to direct the film. He would take on this challenge of aiming to deliver a faithful and gripping portrayal of the story. Anthony Hopkins would sign on one last time as Dr. Lecter. Edward Norton was hired to play Will Graham, even though Ethan Hawke was the first choice. Ralph Fiennes took on the role of Francis Dolarhyde, aka the Tooth Fairy. Harvey Keitel would play this movie's iteration of Jack Crawford, who was the head of the behavioural science unit of the FBI. He enlists Graham to capture the Tooth Fairy. Emily Watson plays Reba McClane, who's a blind woman that becomes romantically involved with Francis. Mary Louise Parker plays Graham's wife Molly, and Philip Seymour Hoffman dons the role of Freddie Lowndes, who's a sleazy tabloid reporter that becomes entangled in the investigation. The plot for Red Dragon follows Will Graham, who's a former FBI agent that retired after capturing the infamous cannibalistic serial killer Dr. Hannibal Lecter. However, Graham is reluctantly pulled back into duty when a new killer emerges, nicknamed the Tooth Fairy, due to his habit of biting his victims. The Tooth Fairy's real name is Francis Dolarhyde, and he has a disturbing fascination with William Blake's painting, The Great Red Dragon and the Woman Clothed with the Sun. Graham is known for his unique ability to empathise with killers, which enables him to understand their motives and methods. He seeks the assistance of Dr. Lecter, who is imprisoned in a high-security facility. Lecter provides insights into the mind of the Tooth Fairy, but also manipulates Graham, as he is deeply fascinated by the profiler. As Graham delves into the case, he uncovers a pattern of violence and obsession in Dolarhyde's life. Meanwhile, Dolarhyde becomes infatuated with a blind woman named Reba McClane, creating a conflict within him. Graham must race against time to identify and capture the Tooth Fairy, before he can claim more victims. Throughout the story, Red Dragon explores the complex psychological dynamics between Graham, Lecter, and Dollarhide. It delves into themes of violence, obsession, and the blurred lines between good and evil. Graham's pursuit of the Tooth Fairy takes a toll on his own sanity, as he must confront the darkness within himself to stop the killer. Filming took place in 2001, lasting several months. Principal photography took place in various locations, including Baltimore, Maryland, and Asheville, North Carolina. The production design aimed to recreate the 1980s setting, and the visual style was influenced by the previous films in the series, with a focus on creating a tense and psychologically charged atmosphere.
It's what I really liked about where Tony went with it. I felt like he pulled Lecter back down not only into sort of the groundedness that was in Silence of the Lambs, but maybe even a little further into a phase of that character where the scales are still tipping back and forth between his insanity and his rationality.
Edward Norton isn't always the easiest person to get along with on set. He disagreed with Brett Ratner, most notably the scene in which Graham visits Lecter in incarceration. Ratner wanted Norton to incorporate a gesture or even some type of look to indicate Graham's fear. Norton felt the audience would not need this if it was filmed correctly. Instead, they compromised and showed Graham's sweat stains where he removes his jacket in the next scene. Ralph Fiennes spent 90 minutes of each day for months building his physique. He even went as far as wearing a prosthetic that gave him a cleft palate. Red Dragon employed practical effects to depict the violent and gruesome nature of the crimes committed by the serial killer. The special effects team worked on creating realistic crime scenes and practical prosthetics to showcase the aftermath of the killings. The attention to detail in these effects also added to the film's visceral impact. Red Dragon released in theatres on October 4, 2002. The film garnered praise for its performances, particularly Anthony Hopkins as Hannibal Lecter and Ralph Fiennes as Francis Dollarhide. Edward Norton's portrayal of Will Graham also received favourable reviews. Some felt that it did not quite reach the heights of the earlier film. However, others found Red Dragon to be a worthy addition to the franchise and a strong adaptation of the source material. It performed well at the box office, grossing over $209 million worldwide. Its financial success further demonstrated the enduring popularity of the Hannibal Lecter character and the interest in the psychological thriller genre. But it would be the last time Anthony Hopkins would play as Dr. Lecter. Red Dragon would release on both VHS and DVD on April 1st, 2003.
Now on DVD, before The Silence of the Lambs, there is Red Dragon. Let the DVD take you inside the mind of Hannibal Lecter. Hosted by Hannibal Lecter. Red Dragon, own it today.
For its DVD release, it would come in 2 editions. The first being a standard 1-disc release that included deleted scenes, director's commentary by Brett Ratner, and some featurettes on the making of the film. The 2-disc release was titled The Director's Edition. It would have all the single-disc special features, as well as a video diary by Brett Ratner, a new featurette, screen tests, and storyboard comparisons. 7 years later, it would release on Blu-ray with the same bonus features as the Director's Edition, with an updated 1080p picture. While this isn't my favourite outing of Dr. Lecter's, it's still a very fun time. Ralph Fiennes is both menacing and chilling as the Tooth Fairy, and is one of the standout elements from this film. After being treated to a gruesome time in Hannibal, it's nice to see that this is a more restrained psychological thriller. I'm going to rate this a 7 out of 10, being a good middle ground for everyone's favourite cannibal. In conclusion, Red Dragon is a must-watch for fans of the psychological thriller genre. With its stellar performances, intense atmosphere, and thought-provoking narrative, it immerses viewers in a world of psychological terror. Brace yourself for a chilling and captivating journey into the mind of madness.